Dr. Erlen with us today, who is a history of medicine librarian at the Bullock Library of the Health Sciences Center at the University of Pittsburgh. And he is also an adjunct assistant professor of history and sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. He runs the History of Medicine program at Pitt. And we also share a variety of people in our background.
Yes, we do.
One other thing that he does of note is that he helps run this website that has been passed around on recent dissertations in medical humanities. So if you want to see some real leading-edge things that are coming out for our new PhDs that are being minted, this is one really wonderful way to go ahead and do it. Some of his talk will also likely be based on his 1999 article with Benedict entitled The Scientific Environment of the Tuskegee Study of Syphilis 1920 to 1960, His Perspectives in Biology and Medicine. And today's talk is called Human Experimentation in 20th Century America, Myths and Realities. Thank you very much, Dr. Erlen.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for inviting me home. When I graduated from Wagner High School in 1964, I don't think I ever foresaw the day that I would be standing in such august presence back in my hometown. And it's great to have this opportunity to come and talk before the Institute for Bioethics, Health Policy and the Law and the University of Louisville Department of Family and Geriatric Medicine. I want to thank Dr. Dukas and his colleagues for their kind hospitality inviting me back home for the weekend, and also the John Graham Brown Cancer Center. My former Pittsburgh colleague, still my colleague, Dr. Bennett Jensen, who really started the ball rolling with this. And I'm going to put on a different hat today, because what I am representing today, I'm a PhD historian who for the last 30 years have taught history of medicine in medical schools around the United States, Southwestern Medical School, Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. I'm not afraid to say that word out loud. University of Pittsburgh. So basically I come from a clinical history of medicine background, and that's what I'm going to be presenting my comments today, much more than my social history of medicine colleagues would be. You will hear a very decided different tone and emphasis than you might normally hear on a topic like this. Let me see if we have any slides, and there we are. And though this is going to be the topic I'm going to be talking about, I want to, since many of you here are not professional historians, which is great, and even for some who are, I want to point out and define a term that will appear several times in my talk today, about which there is a lot of confusion. It's not in the Oxford English Dictionary, hopefully someday it will be, but it's one of the key bugaboos for those of us who try and do objective history of medicine scholarship. And that's presentism. Presentism, very simply put, and I could give you a full lecture on this, which you certainly don't want to hear, is the use of current knowledge, for us sitting in this room today, medical scientific knowledge, and current value sets, be they based on religion, social cultural, PC correctness, whatever, to evaluate, to pass judgment on previous civilizations and individuals and their activities in those civilizations. Almost always leading to such comments as, boy, were they dumb, were they stupid, were they bad, were they evil? And as I will show you today, sometimes they were evil to a percent that even we can't appreciate today. But I would also tell you, unlike many of my social history of medicine colleagues, I truly believe that those who've held the mantle of legitimate healer, so we're going to put the quacks over here, the internet frauds over here, and not talk about them. The legitimate healers, from the shaman through you folk today in 2005, have tried to do the best you can for your patient cohort, be it individually or as a group, given one, the lack or current status of medical scientific, if there is even medical scientific knowledge at a given time in history, and two, the pressures put on by society. You all do not practice your healthcare professions in a void. I give you stem cell research today. Things like this have always gone on in the past. We are always, in a sense, prisoners of our time and our culture. But that shouldn't make us distort our history to fit current needs. This is 20th century American human experimentation, but I'm going to start off with a quote from the middle part of the 19th century and from France, and from one of the great medical research scientists of the 19th century. This is Claude Bernard. I only have 2 quotes today. I will not be drowning you in quotes. In 1865, Bernard made the following statement. The principle of medical and surgical morality, therefore, consists in never performing on man an experiment which might be harmful to him to any extent, even though the result might be highly advantageous to science, i.e. to the health of others. If we were to take Bernard's statement at face value, that the protection of the individual's rights is sacrosanct, what would that mean for human experimentation in 2005 America, here at the University of Louisville? Obviously, it would mean a lot of what you're now undergoing would be severely curtailed, potentially even totally canceled. I don't think anybody in this room really wants to see medical progress come to a total stop. There is more to be learned, and we are learning it, and we'll continue to learn it. And I think we all recognize the value of appropriate, well-designed human experimentation studies in the ongoing progress of medical science. But all of us here, and one of the reasons you're here listening to me today, is you also recognize the potential dangers of overstepping the bounds of accepted medical ethics standards at a given time and putting individuals at risk. And we don't have to go back into ancient history to see how terrible medical science in its search for medical knowledge has overstepped its bounds. You see with this individual being drowned by his Nazi doctor examiners. Terribly disfigured woman at the Nuremberg trial. The Nazi physicians in the dock. By the way, we almost stole them to work for us. They were on the tarmac waiting, Operation Flypaper, and the United States was going to steal them away to work in the United States for us. The authorities caught them on the tarmac once we had the trial. So we went over and we stole the Japanese doctors. Another story. You never should get historians started. We tell stories. It's what we are, professional storytellers. And here are the judges waiting to cast their verdict. But those are the Nazis. I think all of us would agree this is the most depraved culture, if we can even use the word culture, that's ever existed. I would say to you, something like this could never and has never happened to this degree in the United States. But can we be sure that much less offensive, but still highly suspect aspects of human experimentation that harken back have not and maybe continue to be performed in the United States today? And it's interesting to note, when we take a look at the history of human experimentation, who the first real significant whistleblower or whistleblowers were. They didn't come out of the journalistic press. They came out of mainstream hardcore leadership of the American medical profession. And perhaps the most noted of the early names is Dr. Henry K. Beecher. Dr. Beecher was professor and chairman of anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School, a most prominent international figure, and a man, when he thought he was right, not to take no for an answer lightly. In the early 1960s, Dr. Beecher had become aware of a number of what he perceived to be post-World War II human experiments conducted in the United States that did not meet ethical standards. He came up with 22 what he perceived to be flagrant examples, wrote them up, sent them into JAMA, got a nice letter back saying, "Dear Dr. Beecher, most interesting, thank you for informing us. Here I'm paraphrasing. Too hot to handle, article refused." As I said, Beecher was not a man to take no when he thought he was right. He next sent it in to the New England Journal of Medicine, and in 1966, this landmark whistleblowing article appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, discussing these 22 flagrant abuses, according to Beecher. And Beecher comes out and says, there are two basic reasons this has happened in America, post-World War II, post-Nuremberg. One, there's been an ever-increasing amount of federal tax dollars through NIH to support human research. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot more money on the table in 2005 than there was in 1966, and there's a hell of a lot more pressure on your faculty to get it if they want to keep their jobs than in 1966. Secondly, he said there's a new research ethic that has been created out of World War II. We have now moved from a deontological to a utilitarian perspective. I'm a historian, I'm not a philosopher, so I'll use it in my simple terms. This means we'll take the three of you. Thank you, we don't need IRB approval for this. We can take you as our trial cohort. We can expose you to potentially sickening, maybe even deadly pathogens. You may get sick. You may even die during this presentation. Hopefully not. We'll keep you around. But if you do, the knowledge we will have gained will have been so much benefit to everyone else in this room, it would have been worthwhile your sacrifice, and everyone should come up and thank them afterwards. The following year, 1967, Dr. M.H. Papworth, in his book, Human Guinea Pigs, Experimentations on Man, listed some 500. Numbers were really getting big. Post-Nuremberg, American human experiments he thought weren't kosher. Having looked at that, there are a number of them I have to wonder about Papworth. But the trending, ladies and gentlemen, the trending is unmistakable, and it's terrible. What I want to do today is detail in some considerable detail, really, 3 specific cases of human experimentation in 20th century America and the messages, the warnings they should give for us today in 2005 and as we go into the future. I particularly want to deal with one topic, though I will deal with a number of ethical issues per case, and that is informed consent, one of the most difficult concepts then and now to deal with. And you all are much more expert on informed consent than I am, and I will not put you through the quiz that I do my 4th-year medical students who take my history of medicine course, where I said, we get to informed consent, and I say, students, tell me the name of the biomedical ethicist, the philosopher, who coined the term informed consent and first applied it to biomedical ethics. And you see this hit down. I don't let them sweat for long. I'm merciful here. I said, okay, let me change the question. Who can name me the physician who coined the term biomedical ethics and first applied it to the medical malpractice crisis? Guys, you really are smart. You figured it out. Because there was no biomedical ethicist and there was no physician. Informed consent, in quotations, as we use it today, was created in 1957 as a legal doctrine. In the legal case, Salgo versus Leland, Stanford Junior University. The attorney, who died about a year and a half ago, came up with this. It was accepted by the judge, and he first made the legal definition, just like habeas corpus is a legal term. And it has been redefined and redefined in case law ever since. Informed consent today is not the informed consent of 1957. The reasonable man doctrine and a bunch of other things that you could talk about much more extensively. But for us today, remember this, and remember presentism. Because I will come back. There is no informed consent before 57. There is consent. But consent means I, as your healer, doing the best for you paternalistically that I am, will try and get you to follow the therapeutic regimen I set forward. Might have to lie to you, trick you, threaten you, but that's okay, because it's all for your benefit. Good paternalistic approach. Informed consent, 57 on, not before. For today, going back to informed consent, I'm going to define it and use it in the following pattern. And you can easily take this apart, but this is how I'm going to use it for the rest of the presentation. It's much more complex than what I'm going to say. Patients must agree to participation in an experiment based on the real understanding of the cost-benefit for herself or himself. Good luck accomplishing that, particularly with a desperate, really sick patient. Hurry up, doc, get me well. Shut up. Second, the process of getting informed consent cannot be misused by a physician or a medical scientist who could easily mislead or scare a potential research subject into becoming an unwilling volunteer. My Undergraduate pre-med students sometimes seem halfway desperate. Why they think I have any authority, I don't know. I don't. I'm just a historian. To write them a letter of recommendation for their file to get into medical school. Say, sure, Miss Smith, sure, Mr. Jones, I'll be glad to write you that letter. Oh, by the way, I'm doing a little experiment up in my office, strictly non-invasive this afternoon. Could you drop over about 4:30? Yeah, no problem. Won't take long. Just fill out this. How bad do you want that letter? By the way, I don't do that. But I know faculty who do, both in the medical school and undergraduate. You have to remember, students are one of the most widely abused group of potential patient populations, then and now, folks. Regrettably, that has not gone away. Okay, let me get to the first of our three cases. The one I'll spend the predominant part, but I'm going to tie this all up, I promise you, or at least make an effort. July 26, 1972. An article appears in the New York Times entitled, "Syphilis Victims in United States. Study went untreated for 40 years." Other magazines, newspapers, the radio, TV news justifiably got aboard this horrendous story and trumpeted to an outraged American public, decrying this terrible 40-year experiment run in rural Macon County, Alabama, not by a group of renegade scientists, but by the U.S. Public Health Service, your federal tax dollars at work. As the 1972 Medical World News proclaimed, my last quote, "The wound to be avoided is human experimentation that offends the public's sense of decency, such as the now notorious Tuskegee study." The furor that was created over the Tuskegee syphilis study led to several congressional investigations led by such big-name figures in Congress as Walter Mondale, Ted Kennedy, so we're talking real heavyweights here, and would also eventually lead to the creation by the end of the 1970s to such institutional protections of human research subjects as institutional review boards, directly as an outcry against the Tuskegee syphilis study. But we need to ask ourselves today, if we're again going to put on the hat of objective medical historian, what was the public health background to and the actual clinical implementation of this now nefarious study that I'm sure almost everybody, if not everybody in this room, has heard about? You've either read a book on it, you've read the innumerable journal articles that continue to keep coming out in major legitimate journals, you've seen TV movies, you may have just heard it as underground urban myths and rumors, but you've probably all heard about it. I'd ask you to set that aside for the moment. Open your minds as much as you can and listen to a different perspective. We have to start off with a medical fact, an epidemiological fact, and that is in the 1920s and 1930s, the United States was undergoing a significant and growing epidemic of syphilis, specifically, and for reasons never explained, in the states of the old Confederacy, including Kentucky, though we certainly were not the worst. Florida was the worst as a state overall. Obviously, the U.S. Public Health Service was extremely concerned that it get a handle on this ever-growing epidemic, and the way you study a disease, be it syphilis, Legionnaires, AIDS, is first you study the natural history, get the basic science down, then you can look for preventative treatments, and lastly, for therapeutic remedies after the fact, if there are any to become. The U.S. Public Health Service had done a number of studies at Johns Hopkins, other major centers in the North in the late 1920s. They believed they had, whether they did or not, it's not important for this story, but they believed they had the baseline scientific data they needed on primary and secondary syphilis. No need to study that anymore. That story's finished. But they didn't have the data on advanced syphilis in the latent asymptomatic and the tertiary stage. No one had ever done studies on that, and that's what they wanted to study now in the 1930s. They also wanted to study syphilis primarily as a separate unit in an African American cohort. Again, for reasons never explained, and I'm not going to give you any explanations today. I'll let others who know more than I do explain this. But the epidemiological statistics are as clear as can be. There is between a 10 and 12% ratio, black to white, in the number of syphilis cases in America in 1930. Again, you explain why. I will not attempt to explain that. But there was a widespread belief in mainstream medical literature that there might be two brands of syphilis, a black syphilis and a white syphilis. Sounds ridiculous to us today. But this is the medical world of 1930. This is their gold medical standard. Thus, the stated purpose, when it was created in the early 1930s, of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was to see if advanced syphilis in an African American cohort was a unique disease that required unique preventive and therapeutic treatments by the U.S. Public Health Service. In order to achieve this goal, the U.S. Public Health Service decided to run a large-scale control study to learn about the natural history of advanced syphilis in an African American male cohort. Macon County, which looks about as rural. By the way, if you wonder why it's called the Tuskegee study, it really is not because of Tuskegee. There's 6 Macon counties in the South. In fact, if you look at Newsweek last summer, they put this study in Macon County, Georgia. It's in Macon County, Alabama, ladies and gentlemen. Get our geography right. Anyway, the reason they went to this particular county, think about this. Where do you study a disease? If you were going to study Tay-Sachs, would you go to an Eskimo population? You'd kind of be wasting your time, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you look for a group of Ashkenazi Jews living in downtown New York City? Make a lot more sense. Well, an earlier survey of 6 southern counties, 6 states, by the Julius Rosenwell Fund in the late 1920s had shown that there was a considerably higher percentage of syphilitics living, walking around, available as potential subjects in Macon County, Georgia, than any of the other counties studied. That is the only reason they went to Macon County. They went where the disease was statistically the most prevalent. This study was begun in 1932. Here we see someone who might very well have been a participant. I do not know if he was. He would be representative of the sharecropper community from which these individuals were enlisted. By the way, the age of the people in the study ran from 25 to 75. Most of them were over 45. For those who've seen Miss Evers' Boys, this is actual Eunice Rivers. This is the woman who ran the study for 30 years, kept track on the men, made sure they came in for their blood work, was the linchpin of communications between the white researchers and their African American patient cohort, for which she was awarded a national award in the 1950s. Very good movie on this, put out by the National League of Nurses, if someone would like to see some good history on this. I guarantee this is painful, folks. The study was begun 1932. The men were enlisted. Only ended in 1972 because of the public outcry. During this, the U.S. Public Health Service enlisted the, in quote, services, and that's a kindly term, of some 400 previously, please underline that in your mental notes, previously infected African American males, all of whom were in the latent asymptomatic stage, with the exception of 14 who was later found out were just beginning to enter the tertiary stage. At no time was one single person enlisted with primary or secondary. Those who tried to get in the study and showed to have primary or secondary were immediately sent off to the County Board of Health for treatment. But as I'll show, they didn't get treatment there either. That's another part of this very complex story, and it is complex. There has been and remains a tremendous amount of public furor and indignation concerning this ill-fated human experiment, and I could have found innumerable cartoons. This is a non-treatment study by the Public Health Service. Now can we give him penicillin? Tuskegee study. Secret. By the way, it's never secret. That's totally bogus, like so much of this story. Free burial. There was never a free burial. $100 bonus. There was never a $100 bonus. But it makes for a good cartoon. Don't worry about the truth. While some, and maybe even most of the public concern, then and even now, over this ill-fated, federally run human experiment is totally justifiable. This experiment was illegal. This experiment was unethical by the standards of the 1930s. Please hear me out and take that down. This is not a whitewash of what went on. It was unethical and it was illegal. But let me also say that much of the criticism then and now in 2005 has been and remains based on misconceptions and inaccurate medical information, fueled, to use what I term as the Tuskegee myth. Let me now take you through both the myths and the very true and harsh realities of what really did happen during part, not the entire, but at least the initial part of this study, which traditionally is the most damning comments. Let me tell you what I'm using for my source material, because it's key you understand this, because regrettably nobody else is using this source material, and I wish they would. First, official federal government documents that you can go down to the Louisville Public Library, which is a government document depository, and get them off the shelves and read for yourself. I encourage you to do it. Secondly, the 13 case reports published in such major journals as Archives of Internal Medicine, Journal of Chronic Diseases. Again, go over to the Kornheiser Fine Library at the University of Louisville School of Medicine. They're sitting there on the shelves for you to read and interpret yourself. You don't need me to do it, but somebody needs to look at it. And finally, and this is something I don't think you're going to want to take 3 years of your life to do. If you do, you're welcome to do it. A thorough search of the medical literature, both monographic and journal, looking at what was the gold standard, the accepted treatment, black, white. This is not the racial issue. What was the accepted treatment for advanced syphilis from the late 1920s to 1960? What would you, as a good physician, if someone showed up in your office with tertiary syphilis, what would you do for him or her? Otherwise, you'd be practicing quackery and bad medicine. The only person to ever look at this is Dr. Thomas Benedict, Senior Professor of Internal Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine and past President of the American Medical Association. And based on that, we put out, Dr. Dukas mentioned, this article, The Scientific Environment of the Tuskegee Study of Syphilis, 1920-1960, August issue, Biology, Perspectives in Biology and Medicine, and I make you this offer. Pick up the article, read it, go through the footnotes, disprove it, send us the primary material that disproves it, and we will come out in writing and apologize. This has been out since '99. I'm waiting for someone to come out. We stand by our research. Let's first take a look at the myths. I promise you I will not gloss over the realities. So much of what's here is from a book some of you, I'm sure, are familiar, may have even read. Bad Blood by Joseph Jones. How many people here have read this book? Anybody? Okay, one. Okay, Joseph Jones is a most respected colleague of mine. His recent book on Alfred Kinsey, the great professor and pioneer in sexology, is a great read. A little hard to read, but it's wonderful, great research. But this book is a different story. Jones was a doctoral student. He's ABD, started his research on Kinsey and heard about what was going on in Tuskegee. Quit his dissertation research. He's still an ABD and does a quick knockoff book on Tuskegee, doing some of the clinical research, but only some, failing, like so often happens, he's not alone at all, to run this by appropriate medical and MD or PhD medical scientific experts to make sure the clinical medicine is right, and comes out with this book. Okay, so there's some faults. Okay, there are faults in every book. The problem here is that in almost every publication since Jones, people cite Jones as a primary document, not a secondary source that might be fallible. They don't go back and look at his footnotes, or in this case, the lack thereof. So we have the repetition of mistake after mistake, publication after publication. Jones said, therefore it is right. No, ladies and gentlemen, that's not true. Let me hasten to say I agree with most of what's in this book. I think he's nailed a fair amount, the majority amount, of what he says in the book is correct. However, I take very strong difference with Jones and others' medical claims concerning the medical effectiveness of treatments for these men at any time during the Tuskegee syphilis study. Okay, let's start off with the myths. U.S. Public Health Service infected healthy men with syphilis in order to run this experiment. Jones does not say that. Never does he even hint at that. Nor have I ever found this in writing. If someone would be good enough to show me where it's in writing, I'd love to be able to add that to an edition. This is an urban myth. Regrettably, it is a living urban myth in 2005. Think about the logic here, ladies and gentlemen. Which makes more sense? To go to Macon County, round up a group of healthy African American men, infect them, then sit on your hands and knees doing nothing for 5 to 10 years while they get to the latent asymptomatic stage, which is what you want to study, or to take the men already walking around with latent asymptomatic and enroll them and begin your study now. Which makes more sense? Second, U.S. Public Health Service didn't. No, they didn't. They said you've got bad blood. I don't sound like it anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. I can still say it right. I grew up pseudo-South, which is about what it is. Bad blood then, bad blood now is Southern jargon for venereal disease and syphilis. I would also tell you that this was such a paternalistically run study that no matter what they told these African American men, they would have participated because they had no choice. They were not free actors. This comes up all the time in our dearly beloved Hastings Center reports and other great scholarly journals. They didn't get informed consent from these men when they enrolled them in 1932. When is informed consent created? 32. Math is kind of screwed up. This is presentism of the most blatant, propagandistic point. It's just bad history. Withheld effective treatment in order to conduct the study in the pre-penicillin era. Well, let's take a look at the reality of gold standard treatment for anyone in the pre-penicillin era. For primary and secondary, there were a series of very harsh, toxic, arsenic-based compounds. Throw in a little bismuth to kind of cut it down to let the system function. That were gold standard, and you would have been practicing bad medicine if you hadn't used it. It's interesting to note that when it was used at Johns Hopkins in the earlier study I mentioned with an African American cohort, we had an over 1% mortality rate, so 1 out of every 100 patients more died directly from the arsenic. Over 15% became violently ill. And by the way, this was not a short course of treatment. This was 50 to 100 weeks, depending on the doctor's particular inclination. So they had less than a 1% completion rate for the cohort, which several thousand black gentlemen at Johns Hopkins. But that's not the story today. What was the gold standard during these years if a patient with tertiary syphilis walked into Dr. Dukas' office? Too bad. There was no treatment. You would not have given them arsenic. You would have been practicing bad medicine. There was no treatment for anyone who reached tertiary stage syphilis if you're practicing gold standard medicine. That they would have received this treatment, Granted, I've already pointed it's non-existent. But they would have received this treatment if the Tuskegee researchers had never come and natural course in Macon County had gone. Ladies and gentlemen, there weren't 50 to 100 weeks of treatment for any disease for the poor, black or white, in the rural South of the 1930s. These men were imprisoned as much by their poverty as their skin color at this time. And finally, the one that seems to infuriate, I think, the white public the most is that it was widely believed that a shot, maybe a couple of shots of penicillin in the post-1946, and by the way, I apologize, I need to redo the slide. This should say 1960, not 1950. Gesundheit. Would have cured these men and was the gold standard, the accepted standard that should have been applied to these men like it was applied to everyone else. That is the basis for the movie Miss Evers' Boys. Those of you, how many of you have seen that movie? I know it's shown every year during Black History Month as historical truth. You know, there's a little thing at the front of it that says historical fiction. Very little, you can't really see it. I actually met with these people who put this on. They came to Pittsburgh before they made the film. They had heard we were doing the research. They were just curious. They had brought the stage production, which was beautifully done, as is the film. I highly recommend the film for the artistic value, just not for the history or the clinical medicine. And I took down the material that Dr. Benedict had found, and we went down point by point with what was in their script and what they were going to say was in their clinical story, and showed them what they were saying was bogus, was clinically impossible, and never happened. And they said, well, Erlen, you're right, but our story sounds so much more interesting. And after all, this is historical fiction. Remember, folks, this is HBO, not PBS. The reality is this. Until 1960, the U.S. Public Health Service policy on long-term syphilis was do not give people penicillin, period, for fear of directly killing your patients because of what's called the Herxheimer's reaction. This changed in 1960, where the U.S. Public Health Service finally came out and said, well, we really don't think it will help. But we don't believe it'll kill them anymore, so if it makes you feel better, give them the penicillin. It's 2005. Take a look at the infectious disease literature today. They're still debating whether to give people penicillin for tertiary syphilis, which you're only going to find out basically in the third world anyway. I mean, how many cases recently have you seen of tertiary syphilis in Louisville? I wouldn't think very many. I would be very shocked in this particular regard. Even without these myths, the Tuskegee study was both a terribly administered and inappropriately run, both legally and ethically, human experiment. Let's now look at the harsh realities. This was a study of untreated advanced, you need to add the word advanced syphilis, in an African-American male cohort. That's what it was. The U.S. Public Health Service knowingly broke both state and federal laws. There was a 1927 Alabama state law that mandated reporting of all syphilis cases, primary through tertiary, to state health authorities. Totally ignored. World War II comes along. A few, a very small minority, but still a few of the men were young enough to be draft age. The Tuskegee researchers went into collusion with the Selective Service to bar these men from ever going into the service. The researchers blatantly lied to these men about giving them effective treatment. What did they give these men when they showed up for their blood work? They gave them pink-colored aspirin. They gave them some kind of iron tonic, none of which was going to hurt, but to tell these men, one, this was going to retard the progress of the disease, or two, that it might even cure it, they knew they were lying. It may have been the 1930s, lying to patients like that. It's just as unethical then as it is now. They knew what they were doing. Use subtle coercion. Again, it doesn't sound like much. You're dealing with the lowest socioeconomic, least educated group of men in the community. They came up for their box lunches. or rather they got boxed lunches, free lunches, when they came up for their blood work. They were then given free rides into town for shopping. No money to do the shopping, just free rides into town. Their families were given $10, $15, $20, not much more, to help with burial expenses. It's not much. It's enough to be coercion for this group of people. Interesting, we live in a time, justifiably, where there's tremendous past and present concern about how women have and continue to be treated by a predominantly male medical establishment. Why has this never been addressed with the Tuskegee syphilis study? What happened to the women? Remember, these men aren't prisoners. They're in the study maybe 24 hours a year. The rest of the time they're out there with their wives, significant others, potentially fathering offspring, congenital syphilis. What about the women? At a time where contact tracing was the gold standard in America, done by the U.S. Public Health Service. Why wasn't the U.S. Public Health Service concerned about these women in Macon County, Alabama? They weren't. And finally, particularly those of you sitting in front of me here who've ever gotten federal money, this is an amazingly incompetent story. Those of you who've ever gotten even minimal amounts of federal money know the huge amounts of paperwork you have to turn in to get it and then justify keeping it. Can you imagine 40 years, federally funded, federally run, zero written protocol? Zero. In terms of funding, if it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable. We have a note from one of the researchers to a colleague. We finally scraped together amongst ourselves $1.50 for postage to send the recent blood samples back to the Staten Island Research Lab. $1.50. Folks, if you can't do the research then or now, don't start the project. On November 16, 1972, the Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, our old friend, Caspar Weinberger, formally terminated the Tuskegee syphilis study. 8 months later, a class action suit against the U.S. Public Health Service and some of the individual researchers involved in this study was filed against the U.S. Public Health Service, as I said, asking for $3 million per participant. The case was settled quietly out of court for a few thousand per. Still, the legacy of the Tuskegee syphilis study continues to reappear in innumerable medical articles. I know my colleague Susan Reserby has another book coming out on this topic in the next year or two, led up to a formal apology by President Bill Clinton. And the main reason I even bothered following up on this story is the tragic legacy it has for the African American community in 2005, that I'll conclude my comments in about 15-20 minutes here. Again, I want to thank you all so kindly for inviting me back home, and with kind Southern hospitality. In return, I would like to invite you to come up and visit me and my colleagues in Pittsburgh. Here you see a view of the beautiful downtown at the Point. That is the incline from Mount Washington. Football and baseball stadiums over here. The University of Pittsburgh's behind that big black building, the U.S. Steel building, which we thought was one of the targets on 9/11, which is why we evacuated Pittsburgh. Our most memorable day, to put it mildly. And come visit me at the University of Pittsburgh. I will show you around the nationality rooms and the Cathedral of Learning, 28 magnificent ethnic-based mini museums that are well worth at least a half a day. And then invite you to join me up where I live, up in the medical school. By the way, that football stadium no longer exists. That's where our basketball arena, where the University of Louisville will come up and play us now that you're part of the Big East. We welcome you. Another team we can beat up on. No, another team. The old days. Is located. That's the VA in the background. Presby Transplant Center for the United States, as we like to brag here, our medical school complex. And the reason I show this, besides the fact I really would like to invite any of you who can come up, is my next topic is the Salk polio vaccine experiment of 1951 to 55. which was based out of the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Looking around here, I see a few of us, no offense meant, who are old enough to remember, but the vast majority of you, fortunately, come after the worrisome troubles, the worrisome times. Your parents might be able to tell you, some of you are too young even for that, to remember what polio was really like prior to 1954. I grew up with a playmate who had polio. All of us knew somebody who had polio. It's like saying you know somebody has cancer. It wasn't as prominent as cancer, but still. One of the few pictures you'll ever see of FDR in a wheelchair. He hid this beyond belief. But for this disease, he was willing to come out from hiding. Every year, thousands of primarily children are stricken down by this cruel, crippling, and often fatal disease. All big hospitals had this scene. You could go in and you heard this whoosh, whoosh. If any of you are nurses, you should hear the story of the nurses who worked in these rooms, whose hands bled from helping the kids who were incarcerated for the rest of their lives in these iron lungs of death. Raised the money to support the research that made it so none of you all, fortunately, ever went through this. The fact that children were the primary, not sole, but primary victims of this terrible disease. This was an August-September disease primarily, not solely, primarily, the summer disease. Your parents wouldn't let you go to the swimming pool anymore. Years where it was really prevalent, they didn't know why, but when it really looked prevalent, public schools didn't start until late September, and you'd take the first 2 to 3 weeks of your coursework over the radio or play catch-up. Anything to protect the children from this disease. There was a sense of utter desperation in America. Into this environment stepped Dr. Jonas Salk of the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. When we look at the fortunate success of his research, we cannot and should not overlook the ethical issues that my colleague Alan Brandt up at Harvard and a number of other people have studied, but which is not usually currently thought of when you say Salk polio. Most people think of the good. They don't think of what may have been and maybe even what did happen. Let's first take a look at some of the myths surrounding the successful Salk polio trials and the initial introduction of this vaccine to the American public, primarily to Americans' children. There was a success justify the means research ethic coming out of World War II. Therefore, I take my 3 willing volunteers. I will expose you to polio virus. Hopefully, we will come up with some kind of cure before you live the rest of your life in an iron lung. But certainly, we will learn enough information to justify your sacrifice for the rest of the people in this room. Something that's very disturbing. I could give you 100 cases more. The mentally retarded can be sacrificed to gain scientific knowledge. We're a capitalistic country. They're not going to produce. Use them. We can trust the pharmaceutical industry, who funds a lot of what we do here at Pitt and U of L, to maintain high standards, even if it cuts into industrial profits. Sure we can, Nestle's. And finally, a widely held belief then, and under the Bush administration, we are going back to it, that the federal government has no responsibility or limited responsibility to oversee the public's health, even when it means the health of our children, our most precious product. Okay, let's look and see what really happened. It's 1951. Jonas Salk has run his successful test on a batch of laboratory monkeys. Looks good. He now needs a human cohort before he can go out and request a national test on 1 million of America's youth. Well, he does something very wise, clinically and ethically. He goes out and uses the children housed in the D.T. Watson Home for Crippled Children. They'd already been exposed to this disease. They were at no further risk. At least that was the belief system then. Totally ethical, gold standard. No problem. The only problem is there weren't enough children. It wasn't a big enough cohort to convince the national authorities. Need more children. He'd run out of these. So he leaves Pittsburgh. There are lots of children in Pittsburgh. Really are. Then and now. And he goes to a little town, Polk, Pennsylvania. Polk, Pennsylvania is where the Polk State School for the Mentally Retarded is located. And he uses the mentally retarded children instituted there as his test victims, subjects. This should raise several major issues. Why? Why leave Pittsburgh? Why go out in the boonies? Why only mentally retarded children? Why indeed? Granted, this is before, I'm doing presentism. It's before 57, but it's after Nuremberg. It's after the Nuremberg trial. It's after the Nuremberg Code. Research ethics were being looked at differently after 47, 48, if not enforced by law. Why no effort to get any kind of consent? Forget even informed consent. Any kind of consent from these parents, guardians, or children. And there are no records that indicate, nor has anyone ever claimed that he tried to. He just used them as fodder. But it worked. When you say he got lucky or whatever, it worked. Now he goes out and does his investigation on his 1 million volunteers, including Jonathan Erlen. I can put myself right in the middle of this experiment. Actually, that person there is not me, but I was in the first batch who went to St. Matthew's Elementary School that weekday. I drove by there the other day to see if any of my memories would come back. They don't. Head trauma, folks, head trauma. Another story on this, but the school's still there. I went in, rolled up my sleeve. God, I hated needles. I still don't like needles, but I was scared to death. But my parents said, "You got to do it. We want you protected." My parents, and I checked on this, and I did a very informal survey. There was no effort to get, in quotes, informed consent. Consent, you got the kid there. But informed consent using what techniques? You talk about coercion. Remember, this test is not being run nor overseen by the federal government. Total laissez-faire, hands off. It's being run by a private foundation. It's being run by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. Well-meaning though they may be, they have their own strong political agenda. You have Salk versus Sabin, a race to the cure. We can go more here. My parents might very well have volunteered me knowing it was an experiment, but that was not proposed. They were told, get your son inoculated, he will never get polio, period. What kind of parent would you be if you didn't push your kid to the front of the line to be the first to get that shot, so you never had to worry about another summer? A third troubling ethical concern emerged the year after the successful 1954 polio test, when there was a huge rush to get this new miracle drug out to America's children. This is the terrible 1955 Cutter disaster. Cutter was a private laboratory located in California for reasons never made clear. I'm not saying they did this out of malice of heart. Be it speed, be it whatever, they turned out batch after batch of active polio, leading directly to some 2,600 new cases and 11 deaths directly to the use of this faulty vaccine. Again, I'm not saying they did this deliberately, but they sure as heck were responsible. They put it out. It's under their name. You can say, where was the federal government? Sitting on the sidelines doing nothing to protect America's children, turning it all over to the pharmaceutical industry. By 1960, federal laws were on the books. This can never happen again. There is now federal oversight, appropriate federal oversight. A little too late for these 2,600 kids, particularly the 11 who are dead and their families. Thus far, we've looked at two types of human experimentation cases. One, Passive non-treatment, the Tuskegee syphilis study. Sit back, do nothing, and observe. Second, one of potentially active harm, the Salk polio vaccine case. Get in there and potentially give someone what might be a fatal, certainly would be a crippling disease. This third case that I want to talk about, and I'm going to be right up front with you folks, I cannot understand this to this day, how this happened, is by far and away the most egregious of the three. This calls for taking physically healthy children, be they mentally retarded or not, it's part of the story, but it's not important, and knowingly, deliberately giving them a fatal disease and hoping you can cure them before they all die. That does sound like the Nazis to me. Okay, let's take a look at what the Willowbrook hepatitis study was. The Willowbrook Institution, in case you're wondering, I couldn't do anything. I never found a picture of Willowbrook. It's physically gone by the way they blew it up. I'm sure it's called the Willowbrook Wars. The Rothmans are tremendous PhD historians, social history and medicine historians, both at Columbia. This is the story of the deinstitutionalization effort at Willowbrook in the late 1960s that fortunately was successful and would lead to the closing of this institute. The Willowbrook Institution was a large residential school on Staten Island, New York, that warehoused, I use the term warehoused deliberately, over 5,000 mentally retarded individuals, primarily children. From 1949 on, there was an ever-growing number of cases of viral hepatitis in this institution, caused by incredible lack of cleanliness, lack of institutional oversight. Basically, the kids are passing feces hand to hand. It was abominable. It was medieval. You saw the scenes in Amadeus. Might be a little bit mindful of that insane asylum image, perhaps without the straw. I'm not sure there's not the straw, too, in this. From 1956 into the early 1970s, this gentleman, Dr. Saul Krugman, one of the leading international experts in pediatric research, professor and chairman of pediatrics at New York University School of Medicine, and his research staff moved in and opened a clinic in Willowbrook, set up clinic lab, got a group, took some of the only healthy, not the ones infected, the healthy children, and infected them with viral hepatitis to study the natural history and see if they could come up with cures before the kids died. This went on to the early 1970s when the public media, led by an old friend of ours who we don't think of as being a legitimate reporter necessarily anymore, Geraldo Rivera, put a minicam in there and exposed what was going on. And there was a huge outcry. Can you imagine Willowbrook, Tuskegee hitting the headlines literally within a month of each other? What do you think the American public must have been thinking of the medical research programs in America? What should they have been? The public pressure immediately closed down Krugman's studies. He was called to task, not before the bar of Congress, but before the American Board of Pediatrics and the like, his peers, saying, Dr. Krugman, what are you doing? And he says, well, these children were all going to get viral hepatitis anyway, which may or may have not been true. But what he said then was, I have informed consent papers signed on every participant. I'm covered. Well, did he? Was he really covered? What is the true story that so outraged the American public at the same time they're hearing about the Tuskegee syphilis study? Let's first look at the myths. If this looks repetitious, I apologize, but I hope there's a message in this. Success justifies the means. I will now give you 3 viral hepatitis, figuring that you got out of your iron lungs. Hopefully you will survive this too. Please be sure to thank them for their suffering afterwards. All informed consent is good. I have it on the dotted line. It's kosher. I'm covered. You can't get me. Again, the mentally retarded can be sacrificed. If it's starting to sound redundant, good. It was a redundant pattern in the 50s, 60s, and 70s across the United States. And finally, institutional oversight is always reliable. I give you in the last couple of years, University of Pennsylvania, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and 2 deaths through human experimentation. This doesn't stay in the past. That's why it's worth studying the past. Okay, let's take a look at what the realities. Healthy children were infected with viral hepatitis. Everyone in this room is going to die. I don't think you want Dr. Dukas to hasten you along the way. Not that he would, but I don't think you want that. Let's hear an aphorism once: above all, do no harm. Somebody back in the ancient Greeks? History, okay. Informed consent can be drastically undermined. What happened here? For informed consent, whenever possible, Krugman and his research team would gather in a big room as many of the families or guardians of the people he wanted to use as research subjects, the kids, put them down there. He would talk down to them using his $90 words, and then at the end say, "Do I hear any questions? If not, sign on the way out." How many people are going to want to stand up in a room of strangers and ask questions? Then or now. Or if you couldn't make these meetings, you got informed consent via letter. Probably not the best open two-way line of communication. Finally, 1964, Willowbrook is so overcrowded, so filthy, so unmanageable, that it closes its doors to all new admittance, unless the family immediately places their child into Dr. Krugman's experiment. Then we welcome them with open arms. This is blatant coercion, and it worked. Finally, there was a total lack of oversight. No one has ever even attempted to explain how Krugman got access to these kids. What was the leadership, figuring there was, of Willowbrook thinking to let this man in and do what he did? I've actually talked to one physician who worked with Krugman during this experiment at Willowbrook. He could never explain how they got in. Granted, Krugman was a big name. Just because somebody's a big name doesn't mean you come in and let them do this. Don't have an answer. Finally, difficult question. But looking at these examples, we have to ask, is there a special need to protect the rights of the mentally retarded in terms of their even potential participation in human experimentation? And we have to ask a very individualized and sensitive question, for which I have no answer. And that is, do parents of mentally retarded children react differently in giving permission for their children to participate in human experiments than do parents of normal children? There is no gloss over. There is no generality that fits. It is a case by case. Does it ever happen that this might be their only contribution to society? I leave that, ladies and gentlemen, up for you to decide. In summation, let me reiterate my opening statement that human experimentation was and remains and will remain a necessity if medical science is going to continue to advance. However, I hope these three different cases have illustrated that we need to carefully balance the advances we may get in medical science from the potential dangers to participants through lack of informed consent or other abridgments of their human rights. Not privileges, but human rights. And it's the tension between these two, the need to know, the need to protect, that will continue to present hard choices to the medical profession and the general public. And let me close by going back to my first case example and pointing out a very troubling myth that has attached itself to the Tuskegee syphilis myth. And this is one that Dr. Stephen Thomas and I up at the University of Pittsburgh both are working on. I've heard this from my African American colleagues, professional and non-professional. In Pittsburgh, I've checked it out with my colleagues in New York and Philadelphia, where it is flourishing. You all will tell me, please, whether it is flourishing in Louisville. I'd be shocked if it's not. I think it's true in every single urban area in America. Whether it's true in rural America, I'm ignorant on rural America. I can't tell you. This current myth equates, and this myth, the first I heard was the early 1990s, but it may well have been in the 1980s. This current myth equates the federal government's supposed role in the Tuskegee syphilis study with our present AIDS crisis. This myth claims that since the federal government was willing to create cases of syphilis in healthy African American men in the 1930s to run their study. Remember my first myth earlier, about an hour ago? That today the federal government has created AIDS and is using it to plot or do genocide against the African American cohort in America. I hope all of you find this very, very difficult to believe. Regrettably, there was a newspaper article, I don't know if it was picked up by the Courier Journal, a colleague of mine dropped it on mine, saying a survey showed fully 15% of all African Americans in America today believe the federal government is spreading AIDS within the African American community. The problem here is the impact it's having on the public health community trying to deal with the ever-growing number of cases within the African American community. Get testing, get treatment. This is costing hundreds, maybe thousands of unnecessary lives a year. So when and if, and regrettably it may be more when, you encounter this horrendous new myth, I encourage you to pay attention and do everything you can to keep it from spreading further and causing more unnecessary deaths. Thank you very much for your attention.
Someone please turn the lights on in the back there, please. And I imagine we might have a question or two.
I hope so, and I'd be more than glad after people leave to sit around and chat with you one-on-one. My time is yours this afternoon.
Yeah, I do want to hasten to add that Dr. Erlen has graciously allowed for his time after this for individual people to come up and talk as well. So after the question and answer period. So, does anybody have any questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Were any of the results of any of these studies that were published in the open literature as they were ongoing?
The polio, yes. The other two, no. Nothing out of Willowbrook. Certainly nothing out of Tuskegee. It was just terrible medical research. It was a study that never should have been done, and even when they did it badly. Which still, even if they found something, it's like the old saying, should we have opened up the Nazi experiments from World War II? Because God forbid there was something useful, then we would say, well then, what they did to all those Jews and all those gypsies and everybody else was justified. We didn't want to go there. It would be the same with Tuskegee, which is a study that never should have been done. But no, nothing profitable came out. There are a few, but nah. And many of the questions still have not been answered. And now with the success of penicillin, the need to answer the question, tertiary syphilis, has become a third world question, which regrettably we're not very much concerned with in the United States. Yes, sir.
I'd like you to reflect a bit upon Tuskegee, Willowbrook, and then moving on to the Presidential Commission, the Belmont Report, and then from that, sort of the birth of modern bioethics in terms of this time frame of 72 to 75.
There's no doubt that if it had not been for the furor created by both Tuskegee and Willowbrook, Tuskegee more, but still taking mentally retarded children does not sit well with the American public. And there were other, at least hints of impropriety that were starting to come out. And there are a number of books that look at this particular topic. Definitely, this is a significant part, even though, again, if you listen to some of our leaders, it really was the recombinant DNA issue in the Kennedy family that was the key factor that really pushed this over. But if it hadn't been for these, with the Belmont Report and everything else, the need for some kind of federal control over the runaway American medical scientists. We can't just let them go. We can't trust them. Never should have trusted them. Proof is in the pudding. If they'll do this and this, maybe they've done this and this and this. And now, you know, if only we had gotten the radiation experiments with our troops that came out later, this would have really had a fuel of fire. Yes, sir.
Actually, to tag on it, I knew someone who was on the radiation panel, and the irony is, for the audience, if they're not aware of this, the radiation panel, when they came out with their report, which was going to be an extremely heavy-duty assault on this data that showed that there was improper medical research going on for years since World War II. There was one thing, John Moreno.
Oh, sure.
There was one thing that totally sank the story. It was the O.J. Simpson car chase, and it happened on at the same 24-hour period on the news cycle, and it got buried on page A12. And really, except for our Time magazine thing about it, it was buried as a result. It's a historical note that I thought you'd appreciate.
That is interesting. Yes, sir.
In your discussion of the Tuskegee study, you rely heavily on the movie "This Average Boys" as creating what you call a myth. I'm wondering if I'm a lawyer by training, so I apologize. I'm wondering if you are hitting at what you would call a strong man, in the following sense. Martin Nussbaum wrote a book called Poetic Justice in 1975 about how one uses literature, which is really what that is. It's a film. But my reason why I asked the question is that you're taking what I call the third level of This Average Boys, because the actual play that David Felshie wrote,
Which I have seen.
Yeah, and we did an educational video on that. Kind of use of Tuskegee, and to pick what I call a very good entertainment piece as you call them myths, but that obviously touched a great number of people.
It did.
But I guess my only concern is that what you call myths might be myths. Your attempt to say scientific, objective, medical history is the most important thing may miss why people still believe that.
The reality is this, and you can talk about this song and verse better than I can, but you've read Acres of Skin, I'm sure.
I've heard of it.
Okay, I highly recommend it. Acres of Skin is a most troubling book that's come out in the last 5-6 years. Yeah.
I've heard people who wrote that because there's a new commission on prisoner.
Right, and this is dealing with the misuse of prisoners, primarily African Americans, at a major federal prison outside of Philadelphia between the 1940s and 1960s, where the prison warden and the prison doctor went in cahoots and basically sold the prisoners to various pharmaceutical firms for testing agents. And the reason Acres of Skin is some of the material was so toxic that it literally burned the skin off the backs of. There is a long and absolutely legitimate history of the misuse of African Americans by the white medical community, be it in education, be it in experiments, Bones in the Basement, if you're familiar with that book, looking at the drawer. You know, there's a lot of very high-quality scholarship. But what I find, and please refute this to me, but I want to tell you a story here, and there's a true story. And the reason I harp on to, I'm going to get out of the way of that light here, is that amongst at least part, and it may just be the older part, of the African American community, Tuskegee is the top of the iceberg. There's all this stuff down here. I was sitting in a medicine ethics and society class, or medical ethics class, at Pitt 7-8 years ago, and we were looking at racial disparities was our thing. And there was a panel. I was there, and a biomedical ethicist was there, and somebody else was there, some Rollins people. And we had a very lovely African-American lady, early 50s, talking about growing up, I think it was in Birmingham, it doesn't matter, Southern City. Okay, talking about her sister. Found a lump in her breast. Family said, go see the doctor. Yeah. Early detection, early treatment. Says, I'm not going to go. I know what they did to those men at Tuskegee. I'm not going to go. By the time they finally got her in there, it was too late. She died. Potentially unnecessarily. But her closing statement to the audience of second-year medical students has lingered in my mind. She said, growing up in the black community in whatever southern city, everybody knew two things. Everybody knew Christmas, and everybody knew Tuskegee. And that was the end of the session. What a juxtaposition. Christmas and Tuskegee. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I am the manager of the University of Louisville's Wings Clinic, and for those who don't know what Wings is,
Please help me on this
it's
one.
the HIV and AIDS clinic for the university.
Okay.
And I wasn't really supposed to be here this afternoon, but
I'm glad you came.
I am going to this. The reason why I wanted to be here and hoping that you had questions is I deal with this every day. And our new patients that's coming in that are newly diagnosed, not with HIV, but with AIDS, are African American women.
So they're already that far advanced?
Yes.
Jeez.
We are in Kentucky is mirroring what the nation is mirroring with the African American women and homosexual white men.
And Latino women. That's the third major group.
Latino women, because right now we don't have funds to get a translator in to speak Spanish to, translate.
And you have an ever-growing population base here, I know.
And it is moving fast. And we have moved so fast in the last 2 years of me managing it. We have gone from having maybe 75 new patients a year to over 200. And as of today, we're probably having almost 100 from January to May. And it is so scary because these patients are not coming in ahead of time. And we're saying, why aren't these women coming in? Why aren't they being seen? It's because they feel like, hey, somebody's going to, have given it. And they have noticed over the years that they are sick, but they don't want to know because they fear, that it is something devastating like AIDS, which by the time we get them, they're in terrible condition. So this is not something that you can just look at Tuskegee. I tell people, you look at where you at now and in Kentucky, it is for real. And people do not want to be treated because they do remember Tuskegee. And being an African American woman that's 50 years old, I lived in the South. I'm from Florida. And I tell you, my uncle went to Florida A&M, and we heard about Tuskegee in Florida, and we was afraid to go not only to the doctors. You didn't go to the doctor. I never remember going to the doctor till I was 19 years old because people was afraid of what medical treatment would do, especially in North Florida where you was near Alabama, Georgia, and heard of some of the terrible things that happened to people when they went to, especially the large universities and especially to large clinics.
Good. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.